Hi, I'm Annie Davis, and I wanted to do my topic on for case three on caps on medical malpractice damages. So just sort of background, like from the podcast and everything. One issue that really stuck out to me, like sort of in the last few episodes of the podcast, where they sort of went over some things that came up like during the whole story of it all, was the issue of Dunch's patients being unable to get lawyers to represent them in malpractice suits. A lot of his patients wanted to file malpractice suits, and there were only like one or two lawyers that were willing to file them. And so just sort of looking through like why that is, what's the problem with that. And so because all of these cases were really clear cut, like there was obviously malpractice and there was a lot of evidence. There were doctors and nurses that had witnessed his actions. And so um there really is just sort of a question of why in such a clear cut case of malpractice would patients and victims be unable to get representation. So, sort of what they discussed in the podcast was the issue of caps on malpractice damage awards in different legal systems across the United States. So, I did some research around. I think that the numbers are a little sort of in the air because some states are having their rulings challenged right now. So a few states are sort of in limbo on that, or have had their like limits ruled unconstitutional. So it kind of this number fluctuates a little bit year to year. But right now, 30 states have some form of limit on damages awarded in medical malpractice cases. So, what that looks like, most states that do have these limits, there are limits only on pain and suffering. So, there's not a limit on economic damages, which are, damages of actual money that they've lost or would have lost. They only limit pain and suffering because they just don't want the cost of these suits to be astronomical. The issue with these limits, these caps, in this case with pain and suffering caps, is that in the instance where a child or someone who is unemployed is and isn't earning lots of money, if they're injured or killed in a malpractice case, they end up getting nothing. And they can't get representation because the only damages that they would be awarded are pain and suffering and maybe the cost of the surgery and funeral services, but there's no additional money that they can get from that. So attorneys are unwilling to represent them. Additionally, some states even have caps on the fees that attorneys can charge in a medical malpractice case. So there's just really not a lot of incentive for attorneys to represent victims and patients in medical malpractice cases because oftentimes they can't afford to the amount of money that they would get from the case after they've won would not be worth it to prosecute, or not to prosecute, but to file the suit in the first place. And so in the Dr. Death case, this was the situation. It was the Texas caps on malpractice damages for pain and suffering were just not worth it for a lot of attorneys to try and bring these cases to court because they couldn't afford to try the case, to go through with the case, um, just because of the caps. I think, I'm not 100% sure, I think it was $250,000 for pain and suffering caps in Texas at the time. So, the solution that sort of I've thought through for this situation is to eliminate caps, either that or strictly regulate the amount that a cap is allowed to be put for medical malpractice cases. This could take place in the form of a legislative measure. It's voted on, goes through your regular processes to be added as a law, and a federal regulation with pretty clear guidelines as to what's allowed and what's not, just because when you with all the variety from state to state, it really makes it more confusing and sort of leaves a lot more room to make adjustments and make small changes. And so if it were just a clear prohibition or very strict standard for damage caps, I feel like that really could be our best solution here. There are 20 states already that don't operate with a cap on damages for medical malpractice cases in any form. Some of them even have in their state constitution provisions against them so that they can't ever be enacted without like an amendment to the state constitution. So looking at the pros and cons of this, because there definitely are really strong opinions on both sides and really strong points on both sides of this. As far as the pros, in just sort of doing a lot of research, this just gives victims a lot better options. So if you have been a patient that experienced like medical malpractice and had something wrong happen in an operation or even just in a visit, you actually do have the option to go to court, and that is super important, because if you can't get an attorney to represent you because it's too expensive, then you don't really have another option. You can, tell your friends and they might not go to that doctor. You can maybe protect other people, but you can't do anything to get any kind of sort of restitution for yourself. Additionally, having this in place is going to hold bad doctors accountable, because that's the thing, is that this kind of caps and damages are in place sort of as a protection for good doctors, which is great. It's fine. It keeps insurance costs lower for doctors who are not practicing poorly. But for those that are, it's important that they're held accountable, and it's important that if a doctor is practicing poorly, that they can pay some kind of restitution to the patients and the victims that they have injured. Um, Additionally, when you add these caps, it sort of takes away power from the jury and from the judicial system. The whole point of being able to file a civil claim is that when there's not actually a crime that's happened, in this case, medical practice isn't usually considered a crime. It was in the podcast, but like in general, it's not considered a crime. And so people's options are to go through the civil system. And without that in place, if you take away that power, then the judicial system isn't serving its purpose, and that's problematic. So those are the pros of why I feel like that would be a really good idea. As far as some of the cons, so a lot of sort of the underlying idea, which I discussed in pros, is that bad doctors are held accountable, which is going to improve the quality of medical care across the board in the United States. But when comparing the states that do have caps versus those that do not, you don't see a huge difference in quality of care. So that's sort of one argument against it, is that it's not really making that much a difference as far as quality of care. It's not reducing the number of malpractice incidents that we see. And then the biggest con for this is that the cost of malpractice insurance for doctors and hospitals would increase a lot, and you see that across the states that do versus like do not have caps. You see a difference in the cost of insurance premiums for malpractice. And so basically what this, as a result of this, is that cost gets moved on to patients. It increases the cost of healthcare across the board, just because in order for hospitals and doctors to be able to afford this insurance, they have to move that cost. Instead of absorbing it, they move it onto the patients and making healthcare more expensive, less accessible for patients. So that's sort of both sides of that issue. And just moving into my final thoughts, I really feel like the pros outweigh the cons here, and that's just because of the importance of patients' rights and justice in this issue. Because ultimately, these caps are preventing victims and patients who have been mistreated and wronged from getting any kind of restitution from that. And it really just says something about the value that we as a government, as a society, put on human rights and sort of human life. Because when you have instances where there have been children or people who are unemployed, people who are not making tons of money that they would get back as an economic damage, when their only option is pain and suffering, and you take that away, it gives them no option. And I think that it's really important that patients have the option and have the right to be able to right a wrong that's been done against them. It's just really, for me, an issue where there's an injustice being done with the current situation. I think that changing that could really give patients more options and empower them in a way that they don't have right now. As far as just sort of addressing the issue with insurance premiums and that kind of thing, and the cost of medical care, honestly, that right now, with the current American medical system, that as an issue is much bigger than just damages on malpractice caps. Um, and sort of like that's not something that I'm really gonna address because it's a lot more in depth. But the way the American medical system is set up right now is, in general, why healthcare is so expensive for everyone. It's not going to be that just this one decision would really exponentially increase costs for everyone. Sort of the way that the system is set up in the first place isn't helping out patients. It helps out sort of corporate entities, insurance companies, that kind of thing. It's not necessarily set up in the best way to benefit patients. So that's a lot more of a bigger issue. But I do believe that in this case, especially sort of looking at, we saw in the podcast real world examples of how patients were just at a loss. They didn't know what to do. Thankfully, this doctor was in the end held accountable, but most of the time that's not the case. So that's why I wanted to discuss this. It was just something that I found super interesting and was passionate about. Thank you so much for your time.